The satin ribbon scratched lightly against my palm when Megan pressed the envelope into my hand. A soft tap no one else could see, and her perfume, something vanilla and expensive, rose like a curtain between us and the 100 faces waiting for vows. Andrew stood at the arbor smiling with that easy confidence that used to steady me, and the quartet's melody floated across the courtyard delicate as glass about to crack. I could feel my name ripple through the rows, Caroline, that's our girl, while the Arizona sun made the white chairs glow like new teeth. Megan leaned closer, her voice barely above a breath, and told me not to lose my vows because I would need them. I stared at the envelope and felt the same stillness I learned in emergency rooms and late-night phone calls, the kind of quiet that only arrives when the truth decides it's done knocking. The officiant lifted his hands ready to begin, and the envelope grew heavier as if paper could carry the weight of a house. Before I go on, tell me where you're listening from. In the comments, front porch, kitchen sink, a late drive home, and if stories like this keep you company, tap like and subscribe so you don't miss the rest. I promise I'll tell this one straight, the way I wish someone had told it to me. Steady, honest, and without a single wasted word. My name is Caroline, 33 years old, raised in a family where you brought a casserole when someone hurt and a flashlight when the power went out. My dad taught me to check the smoke alarms twice a year. My mom taught me to write thank you notes, even for small kindnesses. And together, they believed that as long as you kept showing up for people, they would show up for you. I built a life from that blueprint, the kind that makes sense on paperwork that mattered at a youth nonprofit. A tidy townhouse with plants that stayed alive, and eventually a man who made planning Sunday feel like a promise. Andrew came with a calm voice and big ideas. He liked market reports and morning runs and the feeling of being the steady one at crowded tables. I met him at a fundraising breakfast. He was the volunteer who arrived early and stacked chairs without a fuss, and he asked if I wanted to grab coffee sometime next week, which turned into that afternoon, and then most afternoons after. Megan and I had known each other since freshman year roommates who swapped sweaters when money was tight and traded night shifts when one of us needed sleep. She had a talent for making ordinary things look beautiful. She could stretch a string of cafe lights across a balcony and turn it into a memory. When Andrew entered the picture, it felt like the final piece sliding into place, someone to watch football with my dad, someone my mother could talk to about neighborhood grants, someone who made Megan roll her eyes in that "you two are disgustingly cute" way that says comfort has arrived. We became the trio you see in engagement photos, me in cream sweaters, Andrew in navy, Megan holding a bouquet and telling me which direction to tilt my chin. If there was a small catch in her laugh, sometimes I chalked it up to old stories and sore places we all carry but don't name. If Andrew occasionally corrected a word I used at a tasting Merlot not Cabernet, I told myself he was being playful, the way couples tease when they're already living in a shared future. The months leading up to the wedding blurred into lists and appointments, all the ordinary busyness that turns love into logistics. I learned the language of seating charts, the delicate art of saying yes to help, while keeping the shape of the day in my hands. Andrew focused on the big picture budget spreadsheets and investment plan that counted years. Like stepping stones, the honeymoon miles he promised to hack with points, and Megan handled the textures, swooping in with ribbon samples and a mock-up of the escort cards that made my mother clap. People said I was lucky to have both, and I believed them. Luck seemed to be the simplest explanation for how smoothly everything moved. On quiet nights, I pictured a small house in Arcadia with a lemon tree, a porch swing Andrew swore he'd build, and Megan laughing in our kitchen while she stole the last slice of pie. I swear I could hear the porch boards creak under the weight of it all, that comfortable future expanding like a lung. But the surface of a perfect life can be like a lake in late fall, glassy, stunning, deceptively thin. I remember the first hairline sound. it made a private, almost polite warning. We were at a dinner with Andrew's colleagues, a polished steakhouse where the silverware reflects you back at yourself, and I excused myself for a minute to call a volunteer who'd had a tough day. When I returned, Megan's hand rested on Andrew's sleeve just a moment too long, just long enough that when they noticed me, both hands snapped away at once, as if burned. My stomach did a small, neat flip. I told myself she was only steadying a joke or a story that my mind was tired from lists and timelines. Later, she made a crack about Andrew always stealing the show in a tux, and everyone laughed, including me, because laughter buys peace when the alternative is looking too closely. The week after that, a second sound quicker and easier to ignore. Andrew's phone lit up on the counter while he was in the shower, and I glanced out of habit the way you do when you're merging onto a highway and check mirrors without thinking. The name on the preview tightened something between my ribs. Megan, a line of words I couldn't fully see, and I turned away as if I'd touched a hot pan, scolding myself for even that much curiosity. We were fine. I told the kitchen, the plants, the calendar with its careful squares. We were adults who trusted each other, and there would be time after the ceremony and the thank you notes to relax again. But once a thin crack finds the edge, it knows what to do with pressure, and wedding weeks press on everything. Your time, your patience, the story you're telling yourself about who you are. On the morning I stood in the courtyard with the envelope in my hand, I could still hear those two small sounds, the polite warning at the steakhouse and the whisper of a notification gliding across a screen. And right then, I understood that glass doesn't shatter all at once. It surrenders piece by piece to the first tap you tried to forget. I didn't open the envelope yet. I only held it, felt its weight settle, and looked up at the man waiting to promise me forever, and the friend who wanted to hold my train as if she'd carried it her whole life. Part 2 begins with what happened when the paper finally tore. I didn't open Megan's envelope during the ceremony. Instead, I tucked it under the silk ribbon of my bouquet, forcing my fingers to steady themselves against the tremor running through me. From a distance, it must have looked like nothing more than a nervous bride adjusting flowers. Andrew's smile didn't falter, but I caught the twitch in his jaw, and the small dart of his eyes toward Megan told me he knew exactly what had just changed. The air in that courtyard seemed to grow heavier, though the music still played, and the officiant's words tumbled on. My family leaned forward in the rows, unaware of the current ripping through the space between us three. I wanted to shout right then to rip open the paper and let the truth scatter like confetti. But part of me knew this moment wasn't the one. It was only the crack before the glass finally broke. That first crack had actually appeared long before the altar, months earlier, in small moments that at the time I brushed away. Andrew had a way of correcting me in public that seemed harmless, even charming to those watching. He would laugh softly and say, "Caroline meant this," as though smoothing over a detail, but the words left me feeling small in front of people whose respect I wanted. I told myself it was love dressed as precision, that he was trying to protect me from mistakes. Megan, too, had her remarks, ones that seemed playful until I heard them replay in the quiet of my mind later. When she teased that Andrew would steal the spotlight no matter what dress I wore, others laughed, and so did I. But the way she looked at him just for a breath made the laughter taste sour. There were evenings when Andrew's phone buzzed while we were out, and he would step outside to take the call. Megan often had a reason to slip away those same nights, claiming she had a design client or a last-minute supplier to meet. I noticed, but I didn't let myself linger on the thought of them overlapping. Instead, I reassured myself that Megan would never betray me, that Andrew was too focused on building his future to risk it. Trust is a stubborn thing. It doesn't surrender easily, even when the evidence piles at its feet. One night, Andrew's company hosted a dinner at a Scottsdale steakhouse, a place with chandeliers heavy enough to bend the air. I left the table for a moment, excusing myself to call one of the teens from my nonprofit, who had been struggling with a crisis. When I returned, Megan's hand rested lightly on Andrew's sleeve, her face turned toward him in a way that felt too intimate. They both pulled back too quickly, too sharp to be natural. Andrew shifted in his chair, covering it with a smile. Megan laughed, saying something about me being the luckiest woman alive. The words should have been comforting. Instead, they pressed against me like a bruise I didn't want to admit was forming. After that night, I started watching more closely, even if I wouldn't admit it out loud. Megan's texts arrived late, excuses about dates that always ended with a question about Andrew's advice or his schedule. Andrew began silencing notifications on his phone, leaving it face down on the counter as though the screen itself carried secrets. Small things easy to dismiss, but together they formed a pattern I couldn't unsee. Still, I clung to the hope that I was imagining it. People in love often convince themselves the impossible is more likely than the truth staring them down. The final push toward clarity came one evening when Andrew forgot his phone on the kitchen counter while he showered. The screen lit with a message, and my eyes landed on it before I could stop myself. It was from Megan. The words were casual at first. Same time tomorrow. Same room. But then another bubble appeared. God, I can't wait to have you again. She's so blind. My breath caught so hard it hurt, and I gripped the edge of the counter to steady myself. When Andrew walked back in, towel draped across his shoulders, I forced a smile. I told him I was just tired, nothing more. He kissed my forehead and passed me without a pause, never realizing that the ground beneath me had shifted. For days after, I tried to convince myself it was a mistake, some misunderstanding, maybe even a cruel joke. But denial weakens under repetition, and I began to see their carelessness everywhere. Megan showed up glowing, her laugh brighter than it should have been, her eyes quick to avoid mine. Andrew came home late, smelling faintly of perfume that wasn't mine, brushing it off with a tired grin and a promise that the project he was working on demanded his time. Each excuse piled on top of the last shaky bricks in a wall of lies. The worst confirmation came on a night when I drove home from a late board meeting. Their cars were parked outside a small boutique hotel on Camelback Road, sitting side by side under the dim glow of a street lamp. I stayed across the street, hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles ached. For half an hour, I begged myself to believe it was coincidence. Maybe Megan had met a client there. Maybe Andrew was seeing a colleague. But when the glass doors opened and I saw them walking out together, clothes slightly wrinkled, his hand brushing the small of her back, the denial snapped in two. They laughed together, light and easy, like the world belonged to them. My vision tunneled. I didn't move the car. I only sat there memorizing the image that would never leave me. That night, I locked myself in the bathroom and crumpled to the floor. My dress from the meeting was still clinging to me. My makeup streaked down my cheeks, and I cried until my chest ached from the force of it. The betrayal wasn't just Andrew's or Megan's. It was the combined weight of two people I had trusted most dismantling the life I had believed in. Memories twisted in my mind. Megan holding fabric swatches, Andrew planning a porch swing, my parents smiling at how lucky I was. All of it felt counterfeit now, the paper version of a world I thought was real. When the sobs finally slowed, something colder began to settle. It wasn't peace. It was rage, sharpened by the sound of Megan's laughter at the hotel and the memory of Andrew's dimples at the altar. I thought of all the small remarks, the corrections, the smirks, the pity in their eyes when they believed I didn't notice. Those weren't slips, they were signs, and I had let them pass as harmless. From then on, I began watching in silence, collecting fragments they left behind. Receipts from dinners that didn't match his calendar perfume, traces on shirts he swore had been at the dry cleaner, messages Megan silenced when I walked into the room. I saved screenshots, photographed scraps of paper, noted license plates. I didn't tell anyone. Not my mother, not my closest colleague, not even my father, who would have seen through me in a second. This wasn't evidence for a fight or a plea. It was evidence for something else, though I wasn't ready to name it yet. In the weeks that followed, I became two people, the bride planning centerpieces and menus, and the woman quietly piecing together her own case. Megan thought she was still the maid of honor guiding me through fabrics and fittings. Andrew thought he was the fiancé balancing work and a demanding schedule. What neither of them saw was that I had stopped playing the part of the oblivious woman. By the time the wedding week arrived, the grief had hardened into something steadier. I smiled when I needed to laugh when jokes landed and kissed Andrew's cheek when family watched. But beneath it all, I carried the memory of that hotel door swinging open and the echo of Megan's words glowing on Andrew's phone. I no longer asked myself if it was real. I knew. And knowing has its own weight, heavier than denial, but sharper too. Because once you see betrayal for what it is, you can't return to the comfort of pretending. That was the place I stood in the final days before the wedding bouquet ribbons, ready evidence, tucked away. The world still believed they were my safe circle, Andrew, my partner, and Megan, my sister, in everything but blood. But I had already started rehearsing the words I might one day say, words that would cut the silence they had forced on me. There's a sound grief makes when it settles in a body. For me, it was the muffled sob pressed into a pillow, the ragged inhale when tears came faster than air, and the dull thud of my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. I spent that first night after the hotel parking lot, curled against the cold tile of the bathroom floor. Mascara staining the grout in streaks I would later scrub away but never forget. Every memory replayed on a loop, Andrew brushing Megan's back, with a touch meant only for me, the way she leaned into him, the sound of their laughter as if I didn't exist. Grief crushed me until it hollowed out, and in its place, something sharper began to grow. The days that followed felt like moving through fog. I went to fittings, answered emails, and smiled when my mother checked in, but every action carried the weight of betrayal I couldn't name aloud. My father called to remind me about seating my uncle away from the bar, his voice steady and practical, and I managed to agree without letting him hear the crack in mine. Megan came over with mock-ups for place cards and fabrics, her perfume heavy in the living room, and I held my breath long enough to nod at her choices. Andrew continued to kiss my temple in passing, asking if I wanted takeout, or if I had reviewed the honeymoon bookings. Every word from him landed like ash on my skin, fine and suffocating. I smiled. I nodded. I went through the motions. Inside, I cataloged each slight and stored it away. At first, I thought I might not survive the weight of it. Rage wanted release, but suspicion demanded proof, and proof is quieter, meaner, and infinitely more patient. I started with what I already had: the texts, the receipts, the photographs I had snapped at a distance, and built from there. I created a hidden drive on my laptop, buried under layers of nonprofit reports and donor lists, and there I placed each piece in neat folders. Bank statements, hotel charges, even screenshots of Megan's smiling face during dress fittings. Every detail became a brick in the foundation of a truth I was constructing for myself. Not for them, not for anyone else, but for me. There were nights I thought about confronting Andrew. I would rehearse words in the dark while he slept beside me, imagining his face twisting into guilt or fury, his excuses spilling over like a broken dam. But every time I stopped myself. Words alone would never be enough. He had charm on his side. Megan had practiced sweetness, and together they could spin lies so quickly they'd trap me inside them. If I wanted the truth to matter, I couldn't let it be a private argument behind closed doors. I needed silence now, so one day the noise could be deafening. The silence was its own torment. I ate dinner across from Andrew while picturing him in a hotel room with her. I answered Megan's questions about bridesmaid shoes while remembering her message. She's so blind. My body shook sometimes when they laughed together in my presence, as though I were already a ghost at my own wedding. And yet I held still, forcing my hands to rest on my lap, training my face to smile on command. To anyone else, I looked like a woman in love, busy and glowing in the weeks before her big day. Inside, I was a woman unraveling in secret, stitching herself back together with threads of anger. One afternoon, I watched Megan from across the living room as she flipped through a stack of invitation samples. She was radiant, flushed with an energy that seemed stolen. Her laugh was bright, her movements restless, and when her phone lit up with Andrew's name, she silenced it with a practiced flick of her thumb. "Wrong number," she said, with a grin, sliding it under her notebook. I nearly believed her, but the smug tilt of her mouth told me she wanted me to. That night, I drove aimlessly until the city lights blurred. I ended up parked outside my parents' house, watching the soft glow of their kitchen window and hearing my mother's laugh through memory. I wanted to walk in to fall apart at their table, but I didn't. I couldn't. My pain wasn't ready to be shared. It was still forming into something I needed to keep private. The weeks closed in quickly after that. Rehearsals, showers, dinners, all the rituals of a wedding stacked one on top of the other, like dominoes waiting to fall. Andrew's parents, Richard and Diane, hosted a small dinner at their home, inviting mine. The air buzzed with polite conversation and the clink of wine glasses. Diane asked about the honeymoon with a hopeful smile, while Richard praised Andrew's latest project, proud of his son's bright future. I sat between my mother and father, smiling at the right moments, but my mind burned with the knowledge of the truth. When Andrew's hand found my knee under the table, I didn't flinch. I let him play the part of the doting fiancé, knowing every affectionate gesture was a lie rehearsed for an audience. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I stood in the guest bathroom at Richard and Diane's home and stared at my reflection under their soft golden light. My face looked calm, composed, even radiant. No one would have guessed the storm moving underneath. I touched my own cheek and whispered, "Hold it together." It was the first time I realized I had stopped grieving. The sorrow was still there, yes, but it had calcified into something harder. The tears were gone. What remained was the beginning of resolve. Back at my townhouse, I sharpened the edges of that resolve. I organized the evidence, arranged it in ways that told a story without needing my voice to explain. Photographs and sequence messages, highlighted receipts labeled. It was meticulous, almost surgical, and the act of preparing steadied me in a way nothing else could. I realized then that I had become my own detective judge and jury holding a case no one else could deny once it was shown. The silence had transformed from suffering into preparation. The turning point wasn't dramatic. It came late one night while Andrew slept in the next room, his even breathing steady and unaware. I sat at the kitchen table with the glow of my laptop on my face, staring at the folder that held everything I had collected. My heart was steady, my mind quiet. For the first time, I felt clarity. I wasn't just enduring anymore. I was preparing. The grief had stripped me down to bone, and what grew in its place was something unyielding. From then on, I wore silence like armor. I laughed when Megan teased me about centerpieces. I nodded when Andrew spoke of investment properties, and I smiled in photographs with my arms looped through theirs. Every gesture was calculated, every expression rehearsed. They thought I was blind, fragile, and pliant. They thought I would crumble when the truth finally reached me. But they didn't know that I had already seen, already felt, already prepared. I carried my silence into every room like a secret. It was no longer the sound of weakness. It was the sound of sharpening. And deep inside, I knew it wouldn't last forever. At some point, silence would have to end, and when it did, it would end loudly. Clarity has a way of slipping in quietly, not with a shout, but with a breath you don't realize you've been holding. Mine came late one night, the wedding dress hanging from the closet door like a question I hadn't answered yet. I sat at the kitchen table with folders spread around me, the glow of the laptop reflecting in half-drunk tea. My hands were steady as I touched the papers, arranging them in neat piles, hotel invoices, bank transfers, screenshots of messages I could no longer deny. I thought about the girl sobbing on the bathroom floor weeks earlier and realized she was gone. In her place was a woman who understood the difference between suffering and strategy. The next morning, I called Martin Wells, a family friend who had guided my parents through legal tangles over the years. His office was quiet, lined with books and framed diplomas, and he greeted me with that measured patience I remembered from childhood. "Caroline," he said gently, "what brings you in today?" I slid the folder across his desk without a word. He opened it, reading line by line, his expression tightening only slightly at the edges. When he finally looked up, his voice was calm. "You understand what this means if you go forward." I nodded, my throat dry. "I understand. I want protection, and I want a way out that leaves him nothing." Martin leaned back, fingers steepled. "We can do that, but it has to be airtight. No mistakes." For the first time since the hotel parking lot, I exhaled. After that meeting, my days took on a strange rhythm. Outwardly, I played the part of the glowing bride, laughing with bridesmaids, smiling at my mother's suggestions, letting Andrew hold my hand in photographs. Inwardly, I rehearsed a new script. I practiced keeping my voice calm when anger threatened to rise, practiced smiling in ways that hid the storm underneath. I learned to stay quiet when Megan leaned close, her whispers dripping with false warmth. It became almost theatrical, and each act I performed convinced them further that I was blind. That illusion was my weapon. The wedding planner noticed none of it. She bustled around with color swatches and vendor calls, thrilled at every tiny decision. I asked her one afternoon about adding a projector for a surprise slideshow, and her face lit up with delight. She thought it was sentimental, a bride eager to share memories with guests. She arranged everything without suspicion, coordinating with the AV technician who never looked twice at the files I handed him. Hidden among engagement photos and childhood pictures was the drive containing the truth, waiting for its stage. Andrew grew bolder in those weeks, confident in my supposed ignorance. He stayed late at the office, his cologne clinging too strongly when he returned his phone, silenced and face down on the nightstand. Once I heard him on a call in the other room, voice low and intimate, and though I couldn't catch every word I heard enough, "She has no clue. Just a few more days." He didn't realize I was awake, lying in the dark with a smile that was more steel than joy. If he thought he was leading me into a trap, he hadn't noticed the walls closing around him. Megan was sharper, always scanning my expressions, always gauging whether her performance was convincing. She hovered during fittings, pinning fabric with hands that trembled only once. "You'll take his breath away," she murmured in the mirror, her reflection smiling like a sister. I held her gaze and let my own smile fade, just for a heartbeat. It was enough to make her blink, to make her ask what. I shook my head softly. "Just thinking about how fast it's coming together." She exhaled, relieved, and returned to her pins. She had no idea the stage she was helping me build. At night, I rehearsed in front of the mirror, not my vows, but the words I would deliver when the silence finally shattered. I practiced how to hold the bouquet without trembling, how to lift the envelope with calm certainty, how to pause long enough for the air itself to turn against them. I even practiced silence because nothing unsettles people more than quiet when they expect noise. By the third rehearsal, I barely recognized the woman staring back. She wasn't the betrayed fiancée anymore. She was something colder, sharper, someone who would no longer be dismissed. The binder that held every detail of the wedding also held something else. Between seating charts and budget worksheets, I had tucked away a single page. In my handwriting, steady and deliberate, it read, "This day won't unite us. It will end them." Every time I looked at that page, the fear that had once consumed me eased into clarity. It reminded me that I wasn't walking toward humiliation, but toward control. The woman everyone thought was fragile was now writing the final chapter of their performance. One evening, my parents came over to help finalize some last details. My mother fussed with the hem of the dress, my father checked the seating arrangements, and both smiled at Andrew when he joined us with his easy charm. They didn't see the flicker in his eyes when his phone buzzed, or the way his hand tightened briefly around my shoulder, as if testing my composure. I leaned into his touch and laughed at something my father said, while inside, I imagined the look on their faces when everything unraveled. It wasn't cruelty. It was justice. The night before the wedding, I stood on the balcony, the city lights shimmering across the desert, the air warm and still. Behind me, the dress hung, waiting, the bouquet ribbons carefully wrapped to conceal the envelope. I whispered into the quiet, not to the stars or to God, but to myself. They won't see it coming. And for the first time in weeks, my chest felt light. I had carried grief. I had carried rage. And now I carried only certainty. From that moment on, every step toward the aisle was no longer about promises. It was about ending the charade. Megan thought she was scripting my downfall. Andrew thought he was securing his future, but neither realized they had already lost. The first act of defiance was small enough to seem invisible. I widened the handle of my bouquet during the final florist appointment, asking for extra ribbon for comfort. She smiled, thinking it was for grip. In truth, I needed a space to conceal the envelope of proof. I had prepared its edges pressed flat against the satin. Megan stood nearby, scrolling on her phone, unaware she was watching me design the hiding place for her undoing. That week, I moved through every event with a sharpened calm. When Andrew's co-workers invited us to dinner, I played the doting fiancé. He rested his hand on my knee under the table, and I let it stay there. What none of them saw was the way his thumb twitched every time his phone buzzed, his body leaning toward the device like an addict. I smiled at the right moment, sipped my wine, and imagined those same colleagues seeing the truth splashed across a screen. The thought steadied me more than the wine ever could. Megan made her own attempts to test me. She came by with coffee and fabric swatches, her voice pitched high and bright. "We're almost there," she said, setting a cup in front of me. I wrapped my hands around it and answered simply, "Yes, so excited." Her eyes lingered on me a little too long, as if she were waiting for cracks to show. When she finally looked away, I knew her certainty was still intact. That was their weakness. They believed they had already won. Late at night, when the townhouse was still, I rehearsed in front of the mirror. I practiced the calm lift of my chin, the steady tone of my voice, the silence long enough to unnerve a room. I trained myself not to tremble, not to break even as rage simmered just beneath my ribs. Sometimes I whispered the words. Sometimes I only mouthed them, letting the silence do the work. Each rehearsal transformed me further from a bride into something colder, something deliberate. I also refined the legal trap Martin had built with me. He had quietly rewritten Andrew's prenup clause so that proof of infidelity before consummation meant a clean annulment, leaving him with nothing. I carried a copy in my binder hidden among guest lists and catering notes. Andrew believed the prenup was his protection. He never suspected it was the rope tightening around his neck. There were close calls. One evening, Andrew came home early, catching me at the desk with papers spread across it. My pulse nearly broke through my skin, but I slid a stack of blank budget sheets over the evidence and smiled. Just crunching numbers. Weddings are expensive. He kissed the top of my head, proud of my supposed diligence. "Good thing you're the detail queen," he said warmly. I almost laughed at how right he was. Megan was trickier. During a final fitting, she noticed me studying her reflection too closely. "Why are you looking at me like that?" she asked, pinning fabric at my waist. I forced a chuckle. "Just thinking this shade might wash you out a little." She smirked, satisfied with her own superiority. "Don't start doubting me now. You'd be lost without me." I smiled back, swallowing every word I wanted to throw in her face. "Not yet." The rehearsal dinner brought its own test. My family gathered with Andrew's at a long table filled with candles and wine. Megan hovered near him more than she should have, offering to refill his glass, laughing a little too brightly at his jokes. I caught a glance pass between them, smug and pitying. They believed they had reduced me to a fool too fragile to notice. I held on to that pity like fuel, because I knew how quickly it would turn to horror. After the dinner, while the others chatted in the foyer, I slipped upstairs to adjust my hair. Alone in the mirror, I caught sight of myself with the veil pinned and my shoulders squared. The woman looking back no longer carried grief on her face. She carried certainty. I whispered softly to the empty room, "Tomorrow isn't for love. It's for truth." My own reflection didn't flinch. The final night was strangely quiet. I stood on the balcony of my townhouse, the desert air, warm and still, the dress hanging spotless inside the bouquet, waiting with its hidden secret. The city lights stretched across the horizon, and I thought of every moment that had led here. Andrew's late-night whispers, Megan's sly remarks, the hotel doors opening to reveal them together. I whispered again, this time louder. "They won't see it coming." The words didn't feel like hope anymore. They felt like a promise. When I closed the binder that night, the single line I had written weeks earlier seemed to glow on the page. "This day won't unite us. It will end them." My heart no longer pounded with fear. It moved with rhythm, steady and prepared. Every detail had been sharpened to precision. Evidence secured, projector arranged, bouquet prepared, legal clause waiting. All that remained was to walk down the aisle and let the silence finally break. The desert sun blazed down on the courtyard, the kind of heat that made every white chair gleam as though polished with glass. Guests fanned themselves with folded programs, laughter rippling low across the rows as the quartet tuned their instruments. I held my bouquet tightly, the envelope pressed beneath the ribbon, its presence cool against my palm. My dress was heavy on my shoulders, the veil brushing lightly against the back of my neck. This was the stage I had built, every detail prepared, every secret ready. At the altar, Andrew stood waiting, dimples flashing as he smiled toward me, his tuxedo immaculate. Megan hovered close by, glowing in pale silk, her eyes sparkling with something only I could read triumph. To everyone else, she looked like the supportive maid of honor, radiant and steady. I could feel my mother's eyes on me, her hand no doubt clutching my father's arm, as she whispered about how beautiful her daughter looked. Across the aisle, Richard and Diane beamed with pride, believing they were watching their son step into the pinnacle of his life. None of them knew they were moments away from watching it collapse. The officiant, raised his voice above the music beginning the ceremony. That was Megan's cue. She stepped forward gracefully, bouquet in hand, and pressed the ivory envelope into my palm. She leaned close enough for me to smell her perfume and whispered, "Don't lose this. You'll need it." Her smirk was small, but sharp as a blade. I tucked the envelope beneath my bouquet where it met the one I had hidden. 2 envelopes, 2 versions of the truth. Only one would survive. The officiant tried again, but my voice cut through the courtyard before he could continue. "Before we begin, I have something to share." My words carried clearly steadier than I expected. A ripple moved through the crowd, whispers shifting programs, curious glances. Andrew's hand tightened around mine. "Caroline," he whispered urgently, "what are you doing?" I turned to him, smiled softly, and said, "Telling the truth." Gasps rose from the rows, my father straightening in his chair, my mother's hand flying to her mouth. Andrew's face paled, his confident mask slipping. "Stop this," he hissed, his voice low, desperate. "You'll embarrass yourself." I raised the envelope Megan had given me, tearing it open. Photographs slipped free, catching the light as they drifted into waiting hands. Murmurs spread, shock sharpening into disbelief. "Does this look like paranoia to you?" I asked, my voice ringing out across the courtyard. Megan's face cracked, her mouth trembling as she stepped forward. "Caroline, you don't understand," she began, but I cut her off. "I understand perfectly. You thought this would destroy me. You thought I'd crumble right here in front of everyone. But you miscalculated." Her voice faltered, her eyes darting across the crowd, searching for sympathy that wasn't there. Andrew tried next, his voice breaking into false warmth. "These are fake. You know me, Caroline. You know I love you." I smiled, cold and certain. "Oh, Andrew, I'm not throwing anything away. I'm handing it back to you." With that, I pulled the second envelope from beneath my bouquet. "This is mine." I gave the quiet signal to the AV technician, and the courtyard dimmed as the projector flickered to life. The first slide appeared text messages in black and white. Megan's words. "She's so blind," followed by Andrew's reply. "She's lucky she even has me." The crowd gasped, some covering their mouths, others muttering aloud. My father rose to his feet. His fists clenched at his sides. My mother wept quietly, shaking her head. The next slide appeared. Andrew and Megan tangled together in hotel sheets, his arm across her shoulder, her smile directed at the camera. The silence that followed was thick, unbearable. Andrew lunged forward, shouting, "Turn it off!" I stepped back, my voice cutting him clean. "These came from your own cloud, Andrew. Every receipt, every transfer, every dollar you spent on her, all on company funds." The words landed like stones. Richard's face drained of color, his jaw tightening. One of Andrew's colleagues muttered in disgust. On corporate cards, Richard finally barked, his voice sharp. "You fool," Andrew stammered. "I can explain," but the screen shifted again, showing Megan's messages about humiliating me at the altar. The crowd groaned, shifting uncomfortably, their faces hardening into open disgust. Megan's sister buried her face in her hands, shaking her head. Megan herself crumbled, reaching for me. "He manipulated me," she cried, her voice shaking. I stepped back, ice in my veins. "You knew exactly what you were doing." Andrew abandoned all pretense, his voice breaking into a snarl. "You vindictive! This was all a setup." I tilted my head, slightly smiling for the first time that day. "No, Andrew. You set yourself up. I just made sure everyone saw it." The projector clicked off, and silence swallowed the courtyard. I turned back to the officiant, my voice steady. "There will be no vows today. There will be no marriage. Only truth." Gasps rippled again, chairs creaking as guests shifted. Andrew's family avoided his eyes, Diane sobbing softly into her hands. Finally, I handed the officiant the binder with the prenup folder. "Consider this annulled before it even began," I said. "Legally, he gets nothing. Not a name, not a dollar, not a claim." Andrew's knees buckled, his face collapsing as though the ground had given way beneath him. Megan sobbed openly, mascara running down her cheeks, searching in vain for comfort. But no one moved. The courtyard was heavy with silence, broken only by the sound of programs dropping to the floor. When I turned, walking back down the aisle, I wasn't a bride anymore. I was the executioner of their performance, leaving behind the wreckage of two people stripped bare in the Arizona sun. The courtyard emptied in fragments, guests whispering as they slipped past rows of chairs still gleaming in the desert sun. I stayed back in the bridal suite veil, tossed aside bouquet lying torn on the table. The silence that followed me inside wasn't frantic. It was cleansing. Outside, I could hear the string quartet packing their instruments without a word, caterers boxing food that would never be eaten, and Richard's voice carried sharply as he barked into a phone. That was the beginning of the fallout, and it spread faster than I expected. Within days, Andrew's company launched a formal inquiry. He had charged hotel rooms and dinners to his corporate card, thinking no one would notice. But the evidence I displayed had already reached the ears of his superiors, who could no longer ignore the trail. His accounts were frozen while the investigation moved forward. Calls from colleagues went unanswered. I heard from a friend inside the firm that meetings once led by him now started with whispered jokes about his arrogance. The golden boy of finance had become a cautionary tale, and by the end of the week, his suspension turned permanent. Megan's collapse came from a different angle, quieter, but just as devastating. Her fiancé, who had been seated proudly in the second row that day, returned her engagement ring the very next morning. He didn't shout, and he didn't stay to argue. He placed the ring on her dresser, picked up his jacket, and left without looking back. At her design firm, clients began pulling contracts, murmuring about trust and reputation. The colleagues who once praised her taste no longer returned her calls. In a city as small and social as ours, word spread quickly. She became untouchable, her name spoken only in hushed tones of disbelief. I didn't have to move a finger to make any of it happen. Truth has a way of sharpening its own claws. Still, both of them tried to reach me in their separate ways. 3 nights after the wedding, Andrew showed up at my door. His hair was unkempt, his eyes bloodshot, his shirt wrinkled. He pounded his fist against the wood until his knuckles must have bruised. "Caroline," he shouted, his voice breaking, "please, we can fix this." I stood silently on the other side, hands folded in front of me, listening as his desperation cracked into anger. "You set me up," he snarled. "You ruined me. Don't you see? You ruined yourself too." The words rang hollow against the door. I hadn't lost anything of value. He had destroyed himself, and I had only allowed the light to reveal it. Eventually, his voice faded, his fists slowed, and the night swallowed him. Megan chose messages instead of knocking. My phone filled with pages of apologies and half-truths. He manipulated me. "I never meant to hurt you. Please forgive me." Each text stacked like bricks in a wall I refused to climb. I didn't answer once. My silence became its own response, louder than any words I could have written. Weeks passed, and Scottsdale moved on with its usual pace, but the two of them could not escape the shadows that clung to their names. I would catch murmurs at cafes or hear a passing comment at a board meeting. "Did you hear about Andrew Hale? Poor Megan Rowe? Imagine humiliating your best friend like that." Their reputations had become stories people told one another, warnings passed like folklore. One evening, I stopped at the grocery store after work. In the next aisle, I heard a voice I recognized, softer than I remembered. Megan's. She was standing by a cart, half empty, eyes hollow, hair tied back without care. She glanced at me once, and I saw the flicker of shame, but she didn't say a word. I moved past her without slowing, and in that silence, I knew she understood exactly what she had lost. Andrew fared no better. Friends whispered that he had been seen at small bars unshaven, begging old contacts for introductions to firms that refused to take his calls. He had built his life on image and connections, and now both were gone. Without the marriage, without the prenup, he had no claim to my family's resources. Every dollar wasted on Megan was his burden alone. Creditors circled him like vultures, his once confident stride reduced to a shuffle. I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate. I didn't need to. Watching them unravel was enough. The cruelest cut came not from anything I planned, but from what the universe delivered on its own. One afternoon, a plain envelope arrived in my mailbox. No return address, only my name in unfamiliar handwriting. Inside was a single photograph. It showed Andrew and Megan seated in a dingy diner, shoulders slumped, faces gaunt. A scrawl across the bottom read, "Still together." I stared at the photo for a long time, the irony settling deep into my bones. After all the destruction, all the ruin, they had clung to one another, like survivors of a shipwreck. The very bond that had betrayed me was now the only thing they had left. That was their prison. Every morning, they woke up beside the person who had cost them everything. Every night, they fell asleep next to the reminder of their downfall. No trust, no future, no escape, just each other. I folded the photograph neatly, slid it back into the envelope, and tucked it into my wedding binder between the seating chart and the vows I never read. Then I closed the book. The story was finished. The photograph of Andrew and Megan sat inside the binder, tucked neatly between the seating chart and the vows I never read. Closing that book felt like lowering a curtain, the final act played out with no encore waiting. Their downfall didn't need more words from me. The truth had already stripped them bare, and the silence that followed was louder than anything I could have spoken. My parents came often in the weeks that followed, bringing dinner, or simply sitting with me in the quiet. My mother would fuss about the kitchen, while my father fixed things that didn't really need fixing. They never asked for details, never pressed. They simply showed up steady as they always had, and in their presence, I remembered where strength had first taken root in me. I hadn't lost my family through betrayal. I had found them again in the way they held me without judgment. Work at the nonprofit kept me grounded too. The teenagers who needed guidance, the families who leaned on us for support, they reminded me that dignity wasn't something others could take, no matter how they tried. It lived in how you carried yourself after the storm. Each time I walked into the office, people smiled, not because they knew the story, but because they felt my steadiness. That steadiness was my quiet victory. Andrew disappeared from the places we used to go. When his name was spoken, it was in hushed tones, often followed by a shake of the head or a pitying laugh. Megan faded into the background too, her once bright presence reduced to a shadow in grocery aisles or whispered rumors at social gatherings. I didn't need to chase them down or force more ruin. Their choices had done that work for me. All I had to do was walk away. The lesson came slowly, but it stayed. Betrayal will always bruise, but it does not have to break you. Silence, patience, and truth can be stronger than rage. When people scheme in darkness, sometimes the only answer is to let their own lies collapse under daylight. I learned that reclaiming dignity is not about shouting the loudest, it's about standing tall when others expect you to fall. Looking back now, I see how easy it would have been to walk away quietly, to bury what I knew, and try to rebuild in private. But if I had done that, the shame would have followed me unspoken, but heavy. By facing it head on, by letting the world see the truth, I wasn't just ending a wedding. I was choosing myself. That choice will always matter more than the pain that led to it. And so I closed the binder, placed it on a shelf, and let it gather dust. My life isn't defined by the lies of Andrew Hale or Megan Rowe. It's defined by the woman who walked down the aisle knowing she would not bend, who left the courtyard with her head high while they crumbled behind her. That was the day I reclaimed not just my dignity, but my freedom. Before we close, I'd love to know what part of this journey spoke most to you. Was it the quiet strength, the patience, or the moment of truth? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you'd like to hear more true family stories, stay connected here.